Hello, everybody. Welcome to this very first meeting, first virtual meeting of the Milpitas Historical Society. It's actually not an official meeting, but kind of our training wheels, we're calling it, to run meetings online. And we will do a presentation, of course. I'm Bill Hare. I am the president of the Milpitas Historical Society. Please let us know you are here in the chat down below. You can just, and let us know when you lived in Milpitas, or if you still live in Milpitas, and if not, where you live now. I want to see where everybody got spread out to. So just let us know down in the chat. The little thing about us, the society was formed in 1980 by Milpitas Post co-publisher Elaine Levine, along with longtime historian Pat Loomis, Parks and Rec director Bob McGuire, school superintendent Leo Murphy, and librarian Ed Cavallini. So this is our 40th year. And we're pretty proud of our website, and our speaker today, Joe, has a lot to do with this. If you want to go check out after this, go to milpitashistoricalsociety.org. All one word, milpitashistoricalsociety.org. And there is a lot of really cool content that we've been putting up. And you can learn about your old school, your old street name, the history behind those names, and lots of other cool little tidbits. You may also remember that we had a display in the food court entrance to the Great Mall. If you were in the Great Mall sometime during the last 20 years. Unfortunately, last year we were kicked out of there to make room for the new Legoland installation. And all of our thousands of historical items have since been, have been in storage since then. So one of our goals of the society since its founding in 1980 has been to have a dedicated museum in town, Milpitas being one of the very last cities in the Bay Area to not have a museum. So 8 years ago, we formed another nonprofit, the Milpitas Community Museum, in order to focus on that task. And I actually hold 2 positions on that board as secretary from the very beginning, and for the last 3 years as president of the Milpitas Historical Society, since there's an automatic board seat for whoever is the president at that moment. So the 2 organizations would obviously work hand in hand on this project, but we can really use as much community support as we can get, both organizations in terms of getting a museum. So mainly, if you can write a letter, let our city council know that it's about time for a permanent museum in the city, we'd appreciate that. And I think we're going to build something pretty good. We have a nice collection. We are actually putting together a lot of really interesting video content, which of course Joe is doing, and you'll hear from him in just a minute. But yeah, that's about it. Let us know you're here, and I'm going to turn it over to Joe.
Okay, I put this presentation, I've put together a number of presentations in the past. One of the reasons for them, some of those presentations were for our general meetings of the Historical Society, if there was something of interest that I could talk about. And then the other activity that I've been involved with Craig Bunnell, who's about a year or so ago, maybe about a year and a half ago, moved to Florida. So I've kind of taken over what we used to work as a team. And it's called the Educational Outreach Program, where I go into elementary schools and do Milpitas history with them. So I've kind of been involved in doing this. This presentation that I'm doing today, this is for you. And so it's the first time this one's been shown. And the key concept that I built this around is the notion that I'm going to show you some things that exist now, and I'm going to kind of fade back into time to show you what was there before what you see today if you were to drive down Main Street. So I'm going to give a brief overview. It'll give you a sense of what's happened in the development of the city. And using aerial photography, and this is basically a pretty recent photograph of what Milpitas looks like. And this is actually even only part of Milpitas, but this is kind of the southern edge. What you're seeing right down in the center there, there's a tag, a red tag that says the Great Mall. I'll show you what was there soon, but kind of the white roofed buildings, you can pretty much think of that as commercial development. And the smaller dots that you see, so profusely on the screen, those are residences, And if you're curious, okay, so this is kind of today. This is what Milpitas looks like today. This is what it looked like when Ford came to town. And actually what the mall is if you will, a renovation, an alteration and renovation of this Ford plant. The Ford plant came in 1955 and operated until 1983, building all kinds of vehicles, cars, trucks, of all various Ford motor makes. But you can see that there was in 1955, which is what, 65 years ago, what we were looking at essentially was, you can see there's a lot of agricultural land, or basically essentially unused, which you would think it was unused land, but it's basically agricultural and ranching. So Ford appearance basically shifted Milpitas, began the shift from an agricultural economy to an industrial economy. But so this is what it looked like before Ford showed up. And I'm going to use my cursor. This zone down here, actually this line off, working, that's where now in South Milpitas, where my cursor is essentially the intersection of Main Street and Capitol. In the old days, this would have been the Oakland Highway, and before that, it would have been called the Mission Road. And so anyways, this veering off here to the right, that's Capitol, and this, now I'm tracing out, that's Landess. This is the Great Mall. This is the Ford plant that preceded it. Something that's kind of and interesting, and it's kind of a white zone here. I'll use a different thing. Right there, that's actually the John Sinnott farm. And I don't want to spend a lot of time on individual people, but he's kind of interesting. He was an early, actually a pretty early migrant to Milpitas from Ireland, and he came actually with the Murphys. If you're familiar with the Murphys, they were huge. Murphy Jr., Martin Murphy Jr. was the founder of Sunnyvale. His father had a rancho to this, basically more toward Morgan Hill, Gilroy, and Martin Murphy Jr.'s brothers. Turns out John Sinnott came with the Murphy family from Ireland to Canada, and then the Murphys left Canada sooner than John Sinnott, but John Sinnott followed, and this winds up being his ranch. And today we have a school named for John Sinnott. This is looking at basically downtown and Milpitas from the opposite direction. This is up in the north, much basically up toward the Sunny Hills area. But this is downtown. It's 1947, so we're just a few years after the war. And here's Main Street, and here's that veering off of Capitol, and Landess would be going out that way. And San Jose, part of San Jose you're seeing up at the top of the screen. But it's very agricultural. This is zoomed in, and this is also a 1947 map. But to give you an idea of what I'm going to be talking about, there are going to be a couple of key buildings. This building I'm going to show you, that's the grammar school. This is an important building across the street from it. The building right next to the grammar school, that's important. I'm going to focus around this agent. This is Calaveras Road. Okay, in those days it would have been called Calaveras Road. This is Main Street. In those days it also would have been known as the Oakland Highway. And this road off to the right here, that's the Alviso Milpitas Road. And so this is Main Street on the way towards San Jose. Well, before township, the town was basically founded as a township right after the the gold rush. So Milpitas, you could say early 1850s, 1854 is one of the dates that we tend to think of, and but they came in to the land that was Milpitas Rancho. I'm not going to talk a lot about the ranchos today because that's actually a separate presentation that I should make that gives the Spanish-Mexican heritage of Milpitas. But I will say that the following thing: the Spaniards came from Mexico up into Alta, what they refer to as Alta California, which is more than just Northern California. It represented about 6 states. It was a very large thing. It was, but they came up to Monterey and into the Bay Area, and they settled. San Jose was the Pueblo de San Jose was formed in the late 1700s, and the ranchos started getting created in the early 1800s. The church really had most of the land in the early stages of the colonization of California. But the key is, this is, if you get before 1850, what you're really going to get is just open ranch land for the most part. You're not really into orchards or anything. They were basically raising cattle and selling cattle, raising cattle for hides. Hides were making leather, and they were exporting that by ship to the East Coast and things like that, and tallow. But so before 1850, in effect, what you really had was just wild ranch lands. The part that I find fascinating is this is the same, the picture on the left is the same picture I was just showing you, but watch what happens. This picture is just around the corner from my house. I took it about 1.5 years ago. Ranching still exists today in Milpitas, particularly extended Milpitas. This is basically up on Piedmont Road. So if you're in town and you look to the east at the foothills, that's where I'm at in this particular video. I'm at the bottom of the foothills. This is the once-a-year annual branding, where they're branding all the cattle. That's actually a requirement, that they brand individual cows, but if you were to go over into where the reservoir is, that was in the backdrop one of my screen. That is still, active ranch land, and as is this. In other words, the eastern slopes. I look out of my house, if you will, or if I go out into the street, and I'm looking up onto these eastern slopes, and this is ranch land for me, and they still do what they did 200 years ago. Okay, so again, so kind of the last overview. You can see the heart of downtown Milpitas in 1947, and this is the Alviso Milpitas Road. This is Main Street, the Oakland Highway. This is Calaveras Road. This is Calaveras Road. Actually, it looks a lot like that today, but one of the things that is kind of interesting is that if you were to go into an earlier photograph, it didn't actually go up into the hills the way it does now. It actually curved over. It actually, maybe from about that location, by the way, if you're curious, is about where the Samuel Ayer House is and where the high school was. But this is old Calaveras over here. And so that actually used to go, that's the old way up into the hills and the Spring Valley up in here. And then it would wander around and up into the Calaveras Valley. That's the key is that's really what Milpitas was like right after World War II. This is a reminder, this is how concentrated and dense it is today. And right down here, that's the Great Mall, that's the Ford plant. But as soon as you get prior to the Ford plant, all of this stuff disappears. Literally all of it disappears, except the occasional dot of a house that represented a farmhouse or a ranch house. Okay, so let's start walking our way through Main Street. It's a reminder of what the growth of population looks like. Now, 1950, Milpitas Incorporated transitioned from a township to a to a city in 1954. But so basically, in that era, we were 500 to maybe 800 people. Typically, there would be seasonal influxes during the agricultural harvesting, canning, picking crop and canning things. But you'll notice after the arrival of Ford, we go from 1950, we go from 500 to 6,500. That's a huge multiplier to happen in a single decade. The next big as a multiplier, of course, is 1960 to 1970. In other words, the appearance of this transition to the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution, Ford manufacturing, that was still pushing population very rapidly, because we had like another fourfold increase on top of the 1960 by 1970. So in one decade, fourfold increase over the prior decade. And we still grow, but it doesn't necessarily grow at the same, fantastic rates of percentage, but it's still, pretty clearly we've gone in 70 years, we've gone from about 500 population to 80,000. So it's pretty big. Now, as far as the local other cities in the Bay Area, we're not really huge at 80,000, but the point is that we've grown a lot. This is Main Street in 1967, and there's a couple things that I'm going to point out to you in 1967 that we'll actually look at specifically. This is going to be an important thing. That's the St. John, Baptist Catholic Church. This zone right in here, there's an awful lot of great interest. This is the Milpitas Alvisa Road here. This is the Oakland Highway, our main street going up. But there's going to be a lot of focus in just this zone for tonight's presentation, or this afternoon's presentation. Okay, this is north. This is, probably anybody that's still living here, you'd recognize this. This is our current library. Some of you who will see this either now or later on a delayed basis on YouTube. This is the library that was built in 2009, but what's interesting about it is you'll find out. And by the way, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you to a modern location and then kind of slide you back in time. But this is the north wing of the library. It's a children's wing, and the second floor is also an extension of the book collections. And I also have computer terminals for people to use on a public basis. This core structure here, architecturally, it's neoclassical. It doesn't necessarily look like a modern library, and there's a reason for that, and we'll get into that in just a minute. Off to the right, that's the south wing of the new library, and the big concrete structure behind here is the garage to service the library. But this core building, this gorgeous neoclassical building, it was opened in 1916, and this is what it looked like when it was a grammar school and didn't have the library embedded around it. I love the idea that they actually, rather than destroy this building, they basically repurposed it. They renovated it, if you will. They changed things in terms of its internal structure to some degree. But the bottom line is that they basically absorbed it into the design of the new library. And so we still have this historic structure that hasn't been destroyed. And that's usually one of two things happens when you really get down to it. We either restore something to its original condition, or we renovate it, by which I mean we maybe keep the structure, but somehow make some modifications, perhaps internally, to facilitate a completely different use from the original use. Or redevelopment, which is when you basically level it and put it something radically different in the same place. So there's several things there to keep in mind as I walk us down Main Street as to whether something's been basically destroyed or whether something's actually been kept in some fashion or other. But this particular grammar school, perhaps what's significant in terms of the title, I'll explain the 1916 in a minute in terms of its opening date, because again, Milpitas Township was more like 1854 in terms of its origin. It closed in 1956. Well, the reason why it closed, and you'll see this illustrated in a minute, was basically it's suddenly with Ford, as Ford starts bringing lots of people in, the plant was actually built here, was shifting production from basically the Oakland area to here. And so a lot of families needed to move in. They had 5,000 employees, on the order of 5,000 employees in its peak. 1956, where the city, we're now 2 years into a city status. There's a lot of pressure in terms of families, in terms of schools, and so the old school that I just showed you, it was replaced by the first two schools that you see here. And in 1956, they were called Sunny Hills and Milpitas Manor. The third school, the elementary school, which opened 3 years later, it was basically came into being, as it were, in terms of planning and construction. Its targeted name was Milford Village. Milford's basically a short form for Milpitas Ford. But they decided on the opening, during the opening of the Alexander Rose School, they adopted a completely different strategy about naming schools, and they went from locale, or the region within the city that these schools existed, to naming them for basically people that had some role in the city itself. So Joseph Weller was an important pioneer. And so Sunny Hills became Joseph Weller. Anthony Spangler, you'll see a bit more about him in a minute. So that Milpitas Manor was renamed Spangler, and so on. And so now it's pretty much named for people and not locales within the city. By the way, Joseph Weller was the one who donated the land for the original schools, and not this school. This is a modern school, but this school, this is on Weller land, and this is the first, what I would say is the in-town school. We had some elementary schools up in the hills, up where Bill lives. Airpoint was up there. Laguna School was up there. So Laguna School is on Bill's property, so it still exists. And there was a Calaveras School over, which is, by my sense of things, is probably somewhere underneath the water of the Calaveras Reservoir. But so there were some elementary schools up in the hills, because it would have been a long haul for people to come out of the hills down to town. But so these two schools, and actually the started out as a single school, the one on the left, and then as the size of the population of the town grew, they built the second structure on the right, and the one on the left became the lower grades of school, and the one on the right was where the slightly older children went. What happened, by the way, with those two schools is they were basically severely damaged in a fire, and they built a temporary structure, and the replacement to them was the grammar school that I started with, the one where the library has been embedded into the library. That was the replacement to those two buildings that I was just showing you. Directly across the street from the library is the Rensselaer Smith House. He was the second physician in Milpitas, so he was in kind of one of the early people. This particular house was built, as a matter of fact, it coincided in time with the construction of the grammar school that's in the library. They both were built in basically 1915, 1916. They were designed by the same architect, Frank Delos Wolf. There was an intention to make the school neoclassical architecture, but there was also an intention in this case. This is called prairie style architecture, which Frank Lloyd Wright really popularized. But so basically the same architect built these two structures, one across the street from the other. Now, this is where you would find this house today, if you were to go down to the library of Main Street and take a look at it. But this is where it used to be, and I'll give you a little bit more of that. But it used to be set back from the street when it was originally built. And I don't have an outstanding way. We don't have any, like interesting clues of somebody standing in the driveway here with a certain kind of clothing or a car that might, whose year might date it. But the trees that you see by the building, they actually help me. I would suggest this particular photograph is probably about 1970, maybe 75, and I'll explain that when I show you this. But again, it was built in 1916. Okay, so this is Main Street in 1947 photograph. It's just, I'm zoomed in. I showed you a more pulled back version of this. That's the grammar school. This is where the library has, basically been built around it. Right across the street, that's the DeVries house, and you can see the arching driveway. But if you look really carefully, you'll notice that the trees are younger, smaller, right? And so what I'm doing when I say that this house in that previous photograph, that photograph might be about 1970, 75, somewhere in there. I'm basically trying to account for the growth in the trees for this house. But like I say, the city basically moved this house down to the street, and then they put senior housing in behind it. Other things that are interesting in this is I'm going to talk about this building, the building right next to the library. You'll hear me talk about that. I'm going to talk about buildings in here. I'm going to talk about buildings in this whole zone quite a bit, and also up here. But anyway, so to give you a sense of things. Oh, and by the way, it's just for information right now, the dividing line between North, Main Street and South Main Street, it's Calaveras roads. So anything to the north, and the north is to the bottom here, that would be North Main Street, and everything from that location there to going towards San Jose, that's going south, that's South Main Street. Okay, so just a reminder, I wanted to get the photograph on the right is the key photograph, but I'm giving you bearings because this is what the right wing, the south wing of the library looks like. So I'm putting up the old photograph to help you orient yourself. What's interesting about this location is that it used to be, remember I said there's a structure next to the library, next to the grammar school that I wanted to show you? It's this structure, and this is one of a number of blacksmith shops that we had in Milpitas. This one dates back to the 1920s, and actually one of the descendants lives in San Jose and is a member of the Historical Society. And he's alive, and we see him every once in a while. This is the Windsor blacksmith shop. This building is what it looked like. That's what it looked like in 1922. And those are his relatives. And something that I know of and I don't actually have a discrete photograph of, but I know that the location. But this is the blacksmith shop. If you look over to where my cursor is, you kind of see a bay window here, and you see a different kind of roof. That's actually the house. That's the Windsor house. And so officially it's over on the street behind Main Street, which is Windsor Street, right? And if you actually were to drive from Calaveras on Windsor Street to the north, 1 block or so, you actually enter the library garage. But these are the Windsors, Now, what's kind of interesting about this, some of this, I don't know how much you can see, but for example, this is a test wall. There's a blacksmith shop. They repaired anything with iron straps, wagons, maybe rims around wagon wheels, horseshoes. They could manufacture farm implements. They could repair, iron implements and so on. But they made brands, cattle brands, and I was showing you about the ranching that even actually still exists today. Well, ranching was certainly big 100 years ago, because 100 years ago, we didn't have a township. Or barely, yeah, well, we did, but it was still a very small township, really, because I don't even have a photograph to show you I don't have an aerial photograph or anything like that to show you what Milpitas would have looked like in the 1920s. But there are brands on this board, on this board, on this board, on this board. These two boards look like replacement boards to me. They're not somebody, they either got busted or something. There's brands here, brands here, brands here, brands here. Well, what's kind of interesting about this is not only did the library integrate the grammar school into its structure, but it did one other thing that's kind of fascinating. And the location of this wall approximates the location of this wall, which is a display within the garage of the library. And so you can actually see, and now these are quite easy to see because they've in effect blackened the bands to make them easy to see. These are burn marks. They would heat up a new branding iron that they're going to deliver to one of the ranchers, and they'd press it into the board. And what they were looking for was uniformity. They wanted to make sure that the brand was good and flat so that they had a good uniform brand. And that's the brand that would appear on the cattle. And you can go see this if you're in the garage in the library. This corner is a big corner, because actually off to the left, you don't see a street in either case, but veering to the left would be Calaveras Road. This is before the Calaveras overpass was built in 1970. And then over at the right frame of the picture, going vertically, if you will, going up, that would have been Main Street. Well, so this is the corner of Main Street. And today it's called Carlos because Calaveras has been rerouted. Well, one of the things that was there before this Buddhist temple was A&W root beer. And anybody that went to school here in like high school in the 50s or 60s or whatever, they would have known about A&W root beer. There's a lot of people on I love old Milpitas, old school Milpitas, that will talk, very fondly about the days when they would go to A&W root beer. But it's an aerial photograph, and it's actually about the same time period. And this is A&W root beer, and right there, and you can actually see the striping of the roof line. So, that to me, I'm absolutely certain that's A&W root beer. This is the gas station across the street. We'll get into that in a minute. This is the Krusich building. We'll get into that. Actually, this over here was, I think that was the Peixote house in the early days, or maybe it was the Crackalisi house in the early days, but we'll get into that a little bit more. But this gives an overview. This actually shows, this is Calaveras right here. And this is the days when it was a street grade crossing, which was a big problem because if when the trains were switching in the Ford era, which would be anytime after 1955, when the trains were switching back and forth and so on and so forth, they could basically shut down this road for a while, and it would actually really stack up with traffic. And since our fire stations were mostly over here on the Main Street side of things, they'd have a lot of trouble getting to a fire on the east part of town because of that. So that was the reason for building the overpass in 1970. Same corner. This is Main Street looking to the south. The street that's turning to the left here, that's Calaveras Road. Same gas station. It's a Shell station. In that previous aerial photograph, it was a Shell station, but the building is completely different. So in other words, this building had been torn down between 54 and into the 1960s. It had been torn down, basically rebuilt again. Across the street from it, where A&W, would have been prior to this in the 60s, 70s, that kind of time frame, was a grocery market, Pop Mills. And if I push earlier back in time, I don't have a photograph that I can show you today, but it was an Amarillo store. So the Amarillo store became the Pop Mills store, which became A&W. But and I remember I mentioned schools number 2 was Spangler, and school number 3, elementary school in terms of the new schools, was Alexander Rose. Well, it's named after the guys that were operating that station there on the left. This is our Kentucky Fried Chicken and a little bit of a strip mall area here, and you you wouldn't think, it gives you no clue as to what would have been there before, but what was there before in the old days, 100 years ago, was a veterinary hospital where if you had injured animals, particularly large animals, like horses and so on, if they were sick, they could bring them to Dr. Boyd, and he could stable them here and heal them, and maybe they'd gotten a cut, or maybe they'd been attacked by wild animals or something like that. And this is where you'd have to take your livestock if you were trying to save them. Just a little bit south of that location, same side of the street, we're looking at the west side of we're looking westward, if you will, of on Main Street. That's today, for anybody that still lives here, that's the Anjan building. And depending upon when you left Milpitas, you would have known it by some other names that I'm going to show you, but this is buildings still exist today. It's a modern photograph, I took that photograph. So somebody that went to school, maybe several decades back or so, they would have known it as the Crackalisi building. And the number of things is that you can see there's some facade changes here. The windows, there's window coverings now that there weren't before. But anyway, and then there's a hardware that was attached to it. This whole storefront area sometimes had different roles, but it was still the Crackalisi enterprise, if you will, over the years. This is the same building. This shows it, for example, as a hardware store and as a drugstore and a veterinary supply off just to the left behind that pole. But this is moving into the 1950s. Now, something I want to draw your attention to is the coverings across the windows on front. They're not there in earlier, say in the 50s, but we still have the kind of the flat roof line way at the top. So those panels in the previous photograph were things that had been added in time. And then the other thing that Bill and I were talking about privately is that you'll notice that the street is a down you have to climb the curb, if you will, 3-step curb to get up to the street level. But that's not the case anymore. It's been built up a lot with asphalt and things like that. I put this photograph in for two reasons. One is, this is out of a 1953 newspaper, which explains this, what's called a halftone, which is what newspapers do to try and prevent too much black ink from saturating the newsprint. They'll do a halftone process that creates these dots. What you'll notice is, first of all, the windows are uncovered. All the windows are uncovered. There are no panels covering anything. And you'll also notice there's, up at the top of the roof line, you'll notice there's a corner up there that's a rising corner. I'll talk about that more in a second, but that's significant because this suggests that after this photograph in 1953, that false front had been modified that I showed you in the previous photograph. The second thing is, this is a very early post office in Milpitas history. I moved to Milpitas in 1967. This post office was no longer used. There was actually a post office that's currently on Carlo. It would have been on it was Calaveras Road then. Basically, Calaveras and Windsor was where the post office was when I came here, and today it's over on Able, so it's in a third location. But the key is, look at that upper left corner, the building. And what that is that's the original. So in 1953, we had the original false front. And this building is the Pashot General Store, and the upper floor was it's Maple Hall, and it was basically a social activity when you needed a large space for a community gathering, an indoor space, like maybe for indoor dancing and things like that. Maple Hall was the place to go, and that's what it was back then. And over to the left, this building, again, it left its scene for a while, but this was the Frank Terra structure. He was one of the early Milpitas. Pashotes they were early too. Peixoto is Portuguese. The building on the left, by the way, it had a variety of different businesses over time. In this particular, this is a postcard. I should note that this is a postcard that was one of a series of postcards that had been created by the founder of the Bank of Milpitas, and I'll be showing you that in a minute. But this was his way of handing out postcards to customers and promoting Milpitas and business. If you turn around and look to the east, we were looking to the west there. If we turn around and look to the east, what we have now is this chain link fence, and what we're starting to see is, this is very recent, within the last few weeks, we're starting to see some construction, which is an extension of this little small strip mall area. But this lot used to be, hold this, it was Cozy Kitchen, and Cozy Kitchen was created just after World War II. Was it Alexander Carlo and Josephine Simas? That was the husband and wife. They founded this business, and this was an institution. This is right on Main Street. This was a big institution. I used to, when I first moved into Milpitas in '67, I used to live up in the northern part of Milpitas on Kurtner Drive, and that's another, big historical name in terms of pioneers in Milpitas. But I used to live up on Kurtner Drive, and I used to drive, there was, at that point, I used to have to come down Main Street, the old route, but anyway, I used to have to come down Main Street to catch 237 and go across the bay, because I was on my way to Menlo Park to go to Stanford Research Institute. I used to go driving by this place, but at that point, I mean, I was on the way to work. I'd had breakfast at home or whatever. So I've lived in Milpitas for like 52 years, and I never ate in that restaurant, which sounds pretty weird to me today, but that's the actual fact of things. But it was a pretty big institution. It was immortalized in a sense in the movie that Bob Burrell and students at Ira High School made a movie called The Milpitas Monster. I'm certain that there are people who might be watching my presentation that have seen the movie at least once. It's a replica of the Cozy Kitchen that they used as a prop in order to film the movie. But that's how, kind of much of an icon of Main Street Milpitas the restaurant was. It actually made its way into the movie. What's interesting, I'm going to back up just quickly. You'll notice the false front is square across the top. Okay, now this photograph was published in a newspaper called the Milpitas Star, which was basically in competition with the startup of the Milpitas Post. But the photograph, because I actually have the newspaper, it's in our archives, and I looked at the original photograph in the newspaper, and what you couldn't actually see was the superstructure, if you will, the false front of the building. Bob Burrell, this photograph appears in Bob Burrell's book, Images of America, Milpitas. And what he did is he drew in, if you will, the structure. So in the beginning of the Cozy Kitchen, it had a structure like this. In other words, this is the same architectural style that we saw in the Peixoto building, and this was also a Peixoto business, one across the street and the other. This was a market, and in particular, it was, in some cases, it was a meat market. But now you see that older style architecture, and it's kind of a fascinating picture of Milpitas. It actually looks like the car. If you were to pull the car out of there, you would think it's kind of a Western town. If you take the car out, and if you take the telephone pole out with all the telephone lines, it would look very Western, old Western. Okay, this photograph is one of my photographs. I kind of tried to take this really intentionally, but you can see off to the right, is, that's the Anjan building, that was the old Peugeot thing. This is the Main Street Professional Center now. It's an office complex. I'm going to show you what happened to that corner. Very important corner because, again, this is the Oakland Highway / Main Street. This over off to the left, that's the mountain, the El Viso Milpitas Road, and actually from El Viso going to the west, it was the El Viso Mountain View Road. So you could really kind of say it's the Mountain View to El Viso to Milpitas Road. So hugely important intersection. We basically had a north-south intersecting with an east-west, and that was really important for commerce and everything. But there's 3 significant locations here. This one here, the southeast corner, that's the northeast corner, right? These 3 buildings, pretty important. I'm going to explore this building in the center with you. It was preceded by the Fat Boy Barbecue Restaurant, which actually was an early day. It was an innovation in its time, 1920s. It was a fast food restaurant in effect, and later on, like I say, in the 40s up into the 1990s, we had Cozy Kitchen, which was just a half a block away, but this is right here on the corner. And what makes the corner an even bigger deal, but this was a big deal, by the way, for people that were driving, say, from San Jose to Oakland down the Oakland Highway here, this might very well be a place that they would, particularly in the 1920s, 1930s, early 40s, this would be the place that they would, so anytime before the war, if you will, between 24 and World War II, this would be one of the places that they could stop to eat. Well, this is an older photograph, but it's really cool in a variety of ways. So there's the Peugeot building right in the center with that big high arch and so on. And there's the Frank Terra building next to it. Well, this was the Fat Boy location, and that's the Milpitas Hotel. This picture was probably sometime in the it would be after 1910, and I'll explain that in a minute. Okay, but and then this is this southeastern location, and that's going to be significant. But just try and remember the structure, the roof line of that particular building, because that building is preceding some other buildings that I'm going to show you. But that's the Milpitas Hotel, which, by the way, originally it opened in like the 1850s. It's gone through a variety of names. Milpitas Hotel at this point. Prior to that, it was Alfred French's Hotel, and so on. So it had some slightly earlier names, but the key is Alfred French Hotel, and Milpitas Inn and Milpitas Hotel. Those are the really significant long-term proprietorships of that particular spot. Now, one of the things I said is it's pretty easy to date, because right here, there's the Peugeot building, and that's the Frank Terra building, and there's no hotel. Well, in 1910, it burned down. Okay, and so now we know that other picture, for 2 reasons, and you'll see another reason in a minute, but for 2 reasons, we know that that previous picture was after 1910, after the fire. So we're looking north in this particular scene. Now, this is an earlier photograph from about the same place, and this photograph comes in the 1890s. And you notice there's a hotel, and that would have been Alfred French. But you'll notice it's structurally different. There's a porch at this, there's a kind of a cover, if you will, a portico for the ground floor. There's porch for the upper floor. That porch was not in the previous thing. So architecturally, there are a lot of reasons why we know this is in the 1890s. It also happened to be published in a book in the 1890s, and that's where this picture came from, is from that book. So we can date it reasonably accurately. But the key is that we kind of a continuity. But this was always a hotel from, say, the middle 1800s up until, say, the 1920s, which is when it transitioned to Fat Boy, and then later it transitioned again into an office building. This is on the southeast corner. Remember I said, remember in that earlier photograph, the kind of that slightly elevated street scene. This roof line, this is what you'd see today. You go down to Main Street today, that's what you're going to see. It's a Red Chili restaurant now. This is basically, okay, things to kind of help find where the changes are or where similarities are. That roof line, that particular roof line, you can kind of remember it, and the struts that are supporting the roof, because that's going to be key to identifying things from a time element point of view. There are these medallions that going along this, those will be significant in terms of identifying changes that happen. Where you're really going to see changes is down here at this street level. Look at the windows, just kind of make a mental note of the windows, and then watch what I'm going to do in the next picture. Same roof, same medallions. It's no longer a restaurant. Basically it was a saloon. For a long time, had a long heritage as a saloon. But you'll notice the window treatment is completely different. And of course you get this iconic wall feature here of the guy with a beer and so on, right? So this is definitely a place to come and drink back in the days of 1970 and sliding backward in time toward World War II. Okay. It was Smith Corners, and you'll notice again, same medallions, same roof structure, support structure, but even a lot more window glass in those days than in Campbell's Corners, and hugely more glass than in today's Red Chili's restaurant. This is a kind of a pleasant street scene in Milpitas. And there's a vehicle over here, it looks like a truck that's parked and so on. Actually, and this was built around 1908. This particular structure was. The location's been occupied since the middle 1800s, but this particular structure is basically in the 1900s, early 1900s. There's a building right there, which is, I'm going to show you very soon, not quite, but very soon, and that's actually the Bank of Milpitas. Okay, so now I'm reminding you about the thing, and you'll notice what we're getting here. Again, I'm bringing this back in to view, which is, so here's the hotel that didn't have the second level, porch, that hung way out and so on, with a railing around it and so on and so forth. So this is a way to resynchronize you to appearances. And here's this building again, and you see, and that's not the same architectural structure that we have with Smith's Corners and Campbell's Corners and Red Chili. And one of the things was there was a major fire in Milpitas in 1910, and it just destroyed a bunch of things. And I think that became a point at which new architectural styles emerged as the buildings were basically rebuilt, but they weren't rebuilt as identical to what they had been. If you flip around from your building on the left, basically Smith's Corners, if you flip, then that's looking westward. If you were to actually if you were standing there and turn around, what you'd see is this particular building. Now, what was at this location, this is interesting, this is a current picture again, and it used to be a sign store. If you needed to go in and if you needed signs or banners or something printed, large scale things that you might put up and things like that. That used to be the business that was in here at one point. But before that, it was basically Milpitas' second fire station. The first fire station, which I didn't did not incorporate a picture of the first fire station because it's about 100 yards away and it wasn't on Main Street. And so I thought it might be a little bit misleading, but the first fire station would have been to the left of the Milpitas Hotel on the Milpitas El Viso Road. This is on Main Street, like I say, essentially looking quasi eastward, maybe in terms of pure direction here, we're looking maybe about southeast, because the hills are over to the left of us, if you will. But it's a fire station, it's where you could go to vote and things like that. So this was number two, right just about the time that the city was going to incorporate, which was 1954. Well, what would have been before that, and there would have been some older buildings there that I don't have a good picture to show you. So there would have been some buildings that preceded that fire station. But if you push past beyond that and get back to photographs that I have available to show you, one of the things that we had basically just across the street and maybe just a tad south of the saloons, Smith's Corners and so on, was a cannery. This was actually cannery number 21. And there were two canneries here. I'll show you another one in a second. There was a different crops were grown in Milpitas depending upon market conditions. And at this particular thing, what they're processing are peas. As a matter of fact, in this upper picture, those are peas on those old the truck and the wagon that's being pulled by the truck. And they're going to be processed by this cannery. This is actually our second cannery, the next cannery I'm going to show you. And then actually the bottom picture give you an idea of staffing, right? So canneries back in those days, if you weren't actually picking at this time, you'd have orchards emerging and things like that, as well as other crops like such as peas. If you weren't one of the farmers and laboring as a worker on one of the farmers, you were probably being occupied, and only when it was seasonal, so it was seasonal work. Your job was, in terms of making some money, was maybe as a cannery worker, and that's an example of. And when they would be very, very busy when it was basically canning time. This was the first factory, Factory 15, different appearance, and actually just a different factory, but it was basically the same location. And this was Milpitas's first factory, at least that I know of, for canning. And this California Fruit Canners Association, what becomes interesting is that's a group of canners, canning businesses. Well, what's interesting about that is that if you think of Del Monte fruit, this is what we're talking about here. Del Monte would have been in one of this association, and basically Del Monte became one of the dominant canning businesses. I can still go to Safeway today and other stores and buy Del Monte products. Okay, well, so just to the south of Smith's Corners, the saloon corner, if you will, just to the south is this building. It's there today. Actually, it's a victim of the pandemic, if you will, but this building was built a while back. But right now, at this moment in December, this is called the Best Sandwiches Cafe. The previous business that was here was the C-Link Cafe, and like I said, it ran about 5 years. It was a victim of the change in business, particularly with restaurants or food places, as a result of this year's pandemic. The person that was running C-Link Cafe is actually pretty much running the business at the Best Sandwiches Cafe, but it's basically now a new owner. But so she's gotten out from under the financial, catastrophe of the pandemic. But anyway, the key is what's significant is if you go right, basically the building just to the south of the Red Chili restaurant is this building, but what used to be there was a Bank of America. And actually there's a photograph that I don't have, which is, this is Bank of America in 1937. The photograph, I would like to have a nice photograph, and I will find one. Usually if I keep digging, and I usually wind up being able to fill in timelines in the archives and things like that. In 1955, this building was demolished by Bank of America, and they put in a modern building to replace it. But so the question is, well, if they destroyed this building, what, in about 18 years from this point, what was the story behind this building? And the key to recognizing this building is, again, looking at this roof structure and the details and so on, because what you're going to see is in 1937, Bank of America occupied this building, but before that, it was Milpitas' first bank. It was the Bank of Milpitas, which was founded in 1912 by Edward Giacomazzi. And remember, we had a photograph, it was a postcard of the Peugeot building. And then I had a postcard of Cannery 15, Factory 15. Those are postcards that are part of a series that Edward Giacomazzi created to I guess, create a record, if you will, of Milpitas at that stage in time. And they were actually printed by, well, let me see, the publisher that was of those postcards was actually in San Francisco. What's kind of fascinating is the printer was actually in Germany. And that same publisher, by the way, in that era did a lot of San Francisco postcards, and a lot of those postcards were by that publisher were in point of fact printed in the same plants in Germany and things like that. But so this is basically Milpitas' early bank, 1912. Edward Giacomazzi is actually of Swiss descent. We have a lot of Portuguese descent, Spanish, Mexican descent, and then of course a lot of the Western European. After the gold rush, we started getting a lot of people from various European extractions. By the way, the Old Joe steamer sign there on the fence in front of that house and off to the left of the bank. What's kind of interesting is that was actually an ad, if you will. Is that the fence was a billboard. Old Joe's Steamer was a beer that was actually made at one of the breweries in San Jose. And something that I am not showing you is to the right of, so this is the bank, and over to the right, there's a gap, and over to the right is the saloon, right? Well, in this space that you're seeing, like where the tree is here on the right, this zone here, this kind of gap, actually in the old, in previously, or actually after this photograph, the Smith houses, there were two houses built here, one behind the other, and Smith, like I say, ran the saloon. So there was some Smith residences over here, after this time. This is going to be pretty interesting from a religious point of view. Again, modern picture, St. John's School. If you look at where the location of the tree and maybe the parking lot, you can see the asphalt there. If you look at that zone right there, that's kind of important because that's the location where the St. John the Baptist Catholic Church used to be. And this is, quite old. Today, so this is Main Street again. Here we're looking north up Main Street, loaded with carriages. Pictures roughly, and actually this would have been a Giacomazzi era postcard, and so but this particular church burned down in 1901. So it was here in 1910, and so I'll show you that a little bit more about that in a minute. The rebuilt St. John the Baptist Catholic Church is now over on basically behind this and maybe just a tad to the north, but this is St. John property. The new church is certainly not in this architectural style, and it's over on Abel, and it's also on church property. And actually this building today would be church property too, this whole complex between Main and Abel. This was the original church. You can see there's a lot of reasons why this, I'll slip back. You can see trees, so you can see time has passed where suddenly now you have trees that are grown up, maybe 10, possibly 20 years old, depending upon the particular type of tree and its growth. You can actually see one of the planted trees right here. Okay, it was just a sprig, but so this picture would have been taken before. Let me see this. Yeah, okay. This church would this particular one would be 1901, and right after its reconstruction, if you will, and I'll show you that in a minute. But this is an important church, Catholic church. Its cemetery is actually up on Piedmont Road, and people that have been Catholic and whose families have lived in Milpitas for a long time, they can be buried up there. That's the original church. That was the church that was built in 1872, and it was the church that was destroyed in 1901. So you can see again, I'll just briefly go back for you to give you another opportunity to look. So it's a bit more elaborate in style, and in particular with the tower here for like ringing the bells. Probably there was probably a bell tower there that would basically call to service, if you will. But that was the first Catholic church. Now, before the church was built, well, two things. One was the first Catholic mass before that was built was actually on John Sinnott's farm, and I mentioned John Sinnott briefly earlier at the beginning, and I'll try to remember to bring him up again at a photo later. I'm not going to spend any time on his particular farmhouse. It was off of Main Street, Old Oakland Highway, but I'm not so much focusing on the residences in this presentation. This would have been the place at which, prior to a church, Catholics could come to for confessions, and it was not in exactly the location of the first church, in the 1870s. Okay. But it was nearby. But this would have been where, like I say, a Catholic service of sorts, confessions and so on, could be administered. It's thought that it was probably along the banks of the Penitentiary Creek. That's kind of interesting from several points of view. I think I put in some aerial photographs, but it turns out Penitentiary Creek, if you're unable and you're going along and you see the flood control canal, is now all straightened and so on and so forth for flood control purposes. But that's actually, it used to be a meandering creek bed and on its way from the hills out toward the South Bay. And the creek had the name Penitentia, and this confessional building was thought to be, near the banks of Penitentia Creek. Becomes an interesting thing. Did they name Penitentia Creek because of the confessional? Or which is probably the case, because like I say, penitentia, it makes sense that it would be thought of as a confessional building. You're confessing, you're taking penance. So that's probably where Penitentiary Creek gets its name, is from this particular early structure before the first Catholic church was built. So gorgeous picture, mostly because of the hills and the clouds and so on and so forth. But the reason why it's here is that we're further down on Main Street, and we're at basically the Elmwood Correctional Facility, basically from the western side of it, looking to the east, obviously, right? And well, why did I want to bring that up? But it's called significantly Elmwood Correction Facility. Okay. Now, if you were on Main Street, you can stop on Main Street. That's before you get to Curtis, before you get to what is referred to in the modern fire station numbering. Fire Station 1 is down on Curtis, which is very close to the Great Mall and Home Depot. And it's also the fire department's administration building. So if you come a little bit north of there, there's this sign. It's partially hidden by this bush, but I wanted this particular angle. This is the O'Toole Elmwood Park. Okay. And you can see these trees lining this. Well, actually, this used to be a lane. And like Main Street is basically where I'm standing and looking to basically looking southwest. So it was angling about 45 degrees off of Main Street. There was this angling lane road. It was lined with elms. The old elms are, they became diseased and had to be torn out, which is a shame because they were very old. They go way back into the 1800s. They're they're yeah. It's the exact date of planting I wouldn't know, but I know that they would have been there for actually quite a while. But they were planted just specifically to line the lane leading to this mansion, John O'Toole. And actually, the O'Tooles, they were brothers, and basically, if you think about where Main Street connects to, say, Capitol, if you look at that point as a southern perimeter, if you will, and work your way all the way north up to today's Sarah Way, and the old days, the Alviso Milpitas Road, that was O'Toole property, generally speaking. And in 1876, that was O'Toole property. And then you would have started these transitions where suddenly, the church starts to appear and things like that. Well, what's intriguing about the O'Toole mansion is, so this was privately held. As a matter of fact, when that was sold, the person who bought it was Boyd, Dr. Boyd, the one who founded the veterinary clinic that I showed you previously. He wound up flipping this thing. And I mean, he owned it for practically no time at all. And what I mean by flipping it is that he paid a low price for the property, the mansion and the property and so on, because it was basically a farm. And he turned around and sold it to the Santa Clara County, and Santa Clara County turned it into an almshouse, which is to say a house for the poor. He made a huge profit. It was kind of the scandal of the moment that the county paid so much more than he had just shortly beforehand had purchased it. Because I think, if I remember, he sold it to the county for $25,000, which was actually at that time quite a bit of money, and way above what he had paid for it. What's the interesting backstory to this is that this at one point was pretty well filled with poor people, but as it became less and less occupied with poor people, the county started putting honor prisoners, in other words, people who were in jail, but they were not regarded as violent criminals and things like that. And again, this was a farm. This was basically a farm location, if you will. And so they would put these honor prisoners in there. And okay, it's actually why Elmwood Jail, because again, Elmwood Lane is what leads up to this property. The Elmwood Correctional Facility is just directly tied to this, and then basically today's correctional facility, if you will, with some gaps in time. It went from an early correctional facility after it had been used as a private housing, and then it had been used as poor housing, and then finally had become some correctional uses. And now today, you've got this huge complex of the Elmwood Correctional Facility. So we're getting toward the end of my talk, and a little bit more to go. This is actually shot from the garage at the Great Mall. Railroads are really important. I could spend a lot of time talking about the importance of railroads to Milpitas, but the key is that today we have Union Pacific operating this line, and it's a freight line, not a passenger line. And actually just to the right of it, right over here, so this rail line is, the Union Pacific, freight line. The BART is running parallel, and it's, and BART is, basically going to be really firing up full scale here, and as coming from all the way up in the North Bay down eventually to into San Jose downtown area. But basically this is the BART thing, and the BART terminal is over there on Capitol. No, I'm sorry, on Landis. But this huge array of lines that you see here, this was the expansion of what was a very simple rail structure in the 1870s. This was the expansion of the rail structure that was necessary to support Ford. what they would do is they would have when this thing would be in its days of massive production, um, these various spurs that you would see here, they'd be filled with, for example, auto carriers, basically cars specifically designed to haul automobiles, and these would be designed to be going to, it would be assembling trains to be going to different locations once they'd been filled, and they'd hook locomotives up to them, and they'd make their run to one destination or another. So they needed to be able to have an elaborate loading facility, and that's what this really represents here, is to show how much development took place, because this is what we used to have just 6 years earlier, if you will. It was a simple rail line. This is a 1949 photograph. It first of all illustrates two things. One is, you can see if you look above, I mean, we have cattle pens here along the rail line, and we have this massive, again, agricultural economy, if you will, at that point, because this is pre-Ford, pre-manufacturing era. And we're still ranching and farming, if you will. So it's 1949. This is kind of a celebratory, you know, a real hoot of in railroad history. What they did is they took an 1869 era locomotive, and which was when the Transcontinental Railroad was created, which dramatically changed the West in terms of how quickly. Prior to that, you would either have to go overland by wagon or to go by sea, either around the tip of South America, but what was more likely is you were going to go to Panama and then trek your way across the Panama Isthmus and climb on a different ship to come up to San Francisco. So once railroads came in, dramatic revolution in basically tying the West to the East. But so this train is like, it's an 80th anniversary of the Transcontinental Railroad that they had done, and to kind of give a sense of what it would have been like in the 1869, 1870 period. So this is, like I said, a special celebration appearance in Milpitas in 1949. So, okay, reminder, okay, so then Ford came in, okay, and we started this transition into an industrial economy. You know, I said I was going to mention John Sinnott. This is John Sinnott's property. I mean, it used to be, before the Ford plant was here, there used to be this lane that came down to Main Street that went to his farm, and he's the one that came with that migrated out of Ireland with the Murphys. There's a big history behind that. That if I do some other presentations, I'd like to do some other presentations on some of the key people that came into Milpitas at different points in time. And John Sinnott would be one of them. And one of the things that's interesting about him, he's Catholic. Murphys are Catholic. They came out of Ireland, right? They first went to Quebec, Canada. Well, they came here. Why? They came to California at the time because California was Spanish. Okay, actually, it was Spanish for the Murphys. John Sinnott came right after the gold rush, so at that point it would have been United States territory. But he was Catholic and very devout, and so were the Murphys. But the first mass before St. John the Baptist Church was built was at John Sinnott's place. So for Catholics, that would be a significant historical point. Ford built a lot of cars here. I mean, it got to the point where they could crank out a car in very, very rapidly, because it was a big facility, you know, where they had been manufacturing before World War II. They had outgrown it. That's why they came down here and built a much larger plant, and they could build a lot of cars, and they were employing about 5,000 people in the 1950s, which is pretty amazing considering that, you know, it was only briefly before that the Milpitas had a population of 500. These are actually Shelby Mustangs that are being built here, but to be more accurate, what they would do is they would build a car with the correct body styles for Shelby, but when you wanted a truly authentic Shelby Mustang, what they would do is they would load these cars, any of these cars that had been contracted, they would load them onto an auto carrier, a train, and they would take them to Southern California for Shelby to do all of his conversion, and then they would be certified. They would really be truly certified as not only a Shelby Mustang, but they would actually carry his certification too, with all of his engine modifications and suspension modifications that he would make to them. But Ford would basically build the basic original car and then ship them off. Well, one of the things that we used to do once we started this industrial area is we started to lose connection to what it was like in the agricultural period. And so some of the businessmen in Milpitas basically started something called Frontiers Day, which was a very festive thing. It was a 4 to 5 day affair. You can see that in this particular poster on the left here, just above the dates. So this particular poster is 1972. It was a 5-day festival. Back in those, they'd have a carnival. So they'd have a carnival. That's Mayor Ben Gross. The young lady who's on the left is Kathy Cardoza. Her father ran a store. It was the Red and White Market on Main Street. And she was an avid horse rider, and she became in 1967, the queen for the Grand National, quarter horse queen. And the young lady on the right, Sylvia Tesse, she was the Indian Princess, Bay Area Indian Princess. They were both, I think, juniors, if I remember, in 1967 in Ayer High School. That was Ben Gross, by the way. He was mayor at the time in 1967. So here you can get the sense of the carnival, the extent of the carnival activity. And by the way, in these particular photos, the location is, there was a strip, in those days, there was a strip of dirt land between Main Street and Able. It was just all dirt from, all the way from Capitol, all the way down to, I don't even think the post office in the early days was there in that location, because it was still over on today's Carlos Street or the old Calaveras Road. But it was all dirt. It's a big dirt lot, and this is, just basically just on the west side of the Ford plant, if you will, okay, on the west side of Main Street. And so that's for quite a while. That's not the only place, but that's definitely one of the places in the history of the Frontier Days where the festival was held. This was a parade activity. By the way, there's a kind of interesting a peek in history. That roof structure, that striped roof structure, that's A&W Root Beer. So we're basically on Main Street, and in those days, this would have been before the overpass. So this would have been Calaveras Road going off to the left and angling toward the hills. And this would have been the gas station. Whoop, hang on a second, get my thing. This would have been the gas station that replaced that previous one that I showed earlier in my presentation, the Spangler Rose. That's the location of the Spangler Rose gas station. But now it's a different structure. Milpitas, there was a Ford club, a Milpitas Ford club, so guys would, get old cars and so on and drive them in parades and so on. Before that, we had the stagecoach. This individual here, that's Denny Weisgerber. Recently, he passed away, but he was, I don't remember exactly, Bill, but he's 90-ish anyway. And he was a former mayor of Milpitas in some of its earlier history and so on. This is Ben Gross. He would have been a mayor probably at the time of this particular photograph and so on. But Wells Fargo in those days, as a promotional thing, as a promotional event, they would go around to various festivals, like a 4th of July or whatever, and have horse-drawn stagecoaches. By the way, before we had bus lines running on the old Oakland Highway, we had stage lines. Literally, we had stages in the 1800s. Well, the ranchers would come down to these festivals on their horses with pretty much, special harnesses and so on for their horses. And actually, what's in the background there that's the old grammar school. So, that'll give you a sense of where they were staging themselves. And one of the relics that came out of the frontier days is, in the photograph after this will be interesting. The Milpitas Historical Society owns this frontier jail. We didn't build it. It was built originally as a kind of a parade vehicle, and I'll explain more about that in a second, for the Frontier Day Festival and so on. Now we take it to public events when, up until the pandemic came on us. The last time that we had this one out, we had decorated it up with, we were in park, I guess Cardoza Park, as a matter of fact, named, for Kathy Cardoza's father, the quarter horse queen. So we'll take it out to festivals, and especially children in particular like to go inside and have their parents take pictures of them. So, and we kind of gave it a Halloween look at the same time by putting cobwebs up and a tape that says, zombie crossing and so on. And it was decorated inside as well as outside. So we have a lot of fun with this particular thing. But this is an older photograph. This would have been in 1967. This was the sixth year of the Frontier Day Festival, and that's Kathy Cardozo in the center. And what's kind of interesting about, you see the 7 sheriffs here. What's going to be really interesting is when I tell you what the point of this was. They used to want to make this very fun kind of affair, frivolous and even prank-ish. And these 7 deputies, when they would tow this down Main Street in a parade and things like that, if men along on the side, they didn't do it to women and children, but if men were clean shaven, they didn't have a mustache or a beard, they'd arrest them. It's not an honest arrest. It was not a legal action. It was a playful prank thing. And they would arrest them, and the prisoner would have to pay $1 to get released from jail. But they had a lot of fun doing that. What I find fascinating was 6 out of the 7 guys here are clean faced. So it's like they needed to arrest themselves. So winding up. So just a few more slides, few more remarks, because one of the things that I'm often presented with is the question, what's the meaning of the word Milpitas? And there is a conventional or a more popularly accepted one. And one of the things that you can do on your own, I'm not going to run the video here because I don't want to take the time to do that, but because you can easily access it yourself. If you go to YouTube, there's basically 2 opinions. The one that's the most commonly accepted is the one that Steve Munzel will describe, for you, which is that the translation is from a Central American Indian language, Nahuatl. But it translates out of small gardens or little cornfields. And one of the books that people can buy about Milpitas is called Little Cornfields. But if you were to go to YouTube and do a search on Milpitas history, Steve Munzel, and if you look for a picture similar to this, you look for Steve in the center there. That's Debbie Giordano on the left and Todd Fleschner on the right. But if you do that search, you can find, I'm showing the URL up there, but that's really kind of awkward to type in and so on. But you can find this and listen to they're interviewing Steve, and he's explaining what he believes and what is basically the most popularly accepted notion of what Milpitas is. If you go to the city website, that'll say Little Cornfields. The Historical Society has tended to be the advocate for Milpitas means Little Cornfields. But Craig Bunnell, who is also was a longtime member of the Historical Society, he moved about 1.5 years ago to Florida. If you do a Google search or a YouTube search for Milpitas history, Craig Bunnell, and look for a photograph where you can see Craig in it. Okay, I provide the URL, but like I say, that's kind of awkward for you to type. You can find this and listen to his thing, and he's basically advocating the notion that Milpitas is a direct translation from Spanish. Mil translates as thousand, and pita is agave. And so what in both cases, by the way, both assertions in terms of the translation, they are suggesting that the name of Milpitas comes from some kind of natural feature. I'll back up, right? So there resided some prominent number of cornfields or garden areas, for example, that was encouraging the notion of this word of Milpitas, which was presumably of Indian origin, Central American origin. Or in Craig's case, he's advocating the Spanish, that it's a Spanish translation, meaning 1,000 agaves. Anyway, that'll give you some own background, and I'll let them explain why they believe what they do believe as to what the meaning of Milpitas is. And this is our website. This is basically, or basically about at the end now. This is our website that you can go to. You can see the website address. Bill mentioned at the beginning, it's Milpitas Historical Society with no spaces, milpitashistoricalsociety.org, there at the top. This article that's showing here, this is a major article that I wrote this recently. It was published in the Milpitas Beat in November. I put it up on the website here in December. It's an extensive history, both of Jose Maria de Jesus Alviso, who was the person who was granted Rancho Milpitas, the land, 4,400 acres and just rough numbers. But if you were to go to our website, one of the things that you can do is you can read, Bill's mentioned this, I plan to expand, I've been doing a lot of research, and I plan to expand the content of the website significantly, and the way in which I'm going to expand it is in articles that don't appear, or actually in articles that provide replacement articles that actually give much more information than some of the information that we have out there now. And that's basically my presentation.